The silence of the land was the only company Caleb Blackwood kept. It was a silence that seemed alive, stretching across the wide Montana plains, breathing through the tall grass, whispering through the cracks of his weathered cabin. At 38, Caleb had grown used to it. He moved like a man who had learned that every step should have purpose, and every word should be earned. His face carried the map of his life, lines etched deep by sun and sorrow, eyes gray as riverstones that had seen too much. Each morning he rose before the sun, stoked the fire, and stepped into the cold that bit through wool and leather. The rhythm of his days was simple: mend fences, count cattle, repair harnesses, eat alone. The quiet was his companion and his punishment. 7 years had passed since fever had taken everything he loved: his father, his wife, his little boy. 3 crosses stood on a hill behind the house, and every sunset turned them to gold. That was where his eyes went when he sat by the window at night. The land around him was both cruel and beautiful. The sky was endless, blinding blue in summer, iron gray in winter. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and sometimes loneliness so sharp it hurt to breathe. The only sounds were the cry of a hawk and the lowing of distant cattle. To survive here, a man had to be strong. To stay, he had to have nowhere else to go. Caleb stayed. Then, one crisp morning in early November, something changed. A stranger stepped off the stagecoach in the nearby town of Redemption. Her name was A.A.R.A. She carried a single worn valise and wore a simple gray dress, plain but carefully mended. She was not young, yet not old, somewhere in her late 20s, with skin that caught the light in warm tones and eyes that seemed to hide a lifetime of secrets. She spoke little, smiled less, and worked hard. The townsfolk noticed her immediately, and in a place where gossip was as common as dust, whispers began before the day was done. A woman alone with no husband, no family, no history. Redemption didn't take kindly to mysteries. Some said she was a widow running from her past. Others said she'd been cast out from somewhere back east. Mrs. Holt, the preacher's wife, called her a bad omen before the church bells even stopped ringing. But AARA didn't argue. She kept to herself, found work at the mercantile, mending clothes and keeping accounts. Each evening she returned to her small rented room above the store, lit a single candle, and looked out across the empty street until the flame burned low. Weeks passed before her path crossed Caleb's. He rode into town for supplies, his monthly ritual, hat low, coat dusted from the long ride. Inside the mercantile, the smell of coffee and leather filled the air. She stood behind the counter, measuring calico for a customer, her movements calm and precise. Caleb waited near the barrels of nails, half listening to the women whisper about her. When it was his turn, he placed his list on the counter. "Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges," he said quietly. She looked up, and for a moment, the world stilled. Her gaze met his, 2 people marked by loneliness, each recognizing the same kind of sorrow in the other. She gathered his items quickly, her fingers brushing his when she handed him the change. Her hand trembled, and he noticed. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. She gave a small nod, voice barely above a whisper. "Safe ride home, sir." That night, as Caleb rode back across the wide valley, her face stayed with him, the guarded eyes, the soft tremor in her hand, the sadness he couldn't name. He told himself it was nothing. He'd built his life on not feeling too much. But the silence felt heavier when he returned home. A week later, winter came early. The morning sky turned pewter, and the wind howled through the cottonwoods like a living thing. By noon, snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. Caleb saddled his horse, Silas, to check the northern fence line before the storm worsened. The world vanished in white. Miles away, AARA was caught in that same storm. Mr. Henderson at the mercantile had sent her to deliver a package to a homestead outside town. Eager to keep her job, she had borrowed an old wagon and a tired horse. The blizzard hit halfway back. The wind tore her breath away, snow stinging her face, her coat too thin for the cold. The road disappeared. When the horse stumbled and the wagon tipped, she was thrown into a snowdrift. She fought to stand, but the cold was a living thing now, creeping into her bones, slowing her heartbeat. She tried to lead the horse, but it wouldn't move. The wind screamed through the empty land, drowning her sobs. She sank beside the broken wagon, the world fading into a blur of white. Caleb found her purely by chance. Silas balked at something buried in the snow near the fence. Caleb dismounted, his boots sinking deep. Beneath the drift lay the overturned wagon, and a still figure beside it. His heart lurched. He brushed away the snow and saw her face, pale as death. "It's you," he murmured. Her pulse was faint, but there. Without hesitation, he lifted her into his arms. She was light, frighteningly so. Wrapping his heavy coat around her, he mounted Silas and turned toward home, the storm clawing at his back. Hours later, the fire in his cabin roared high, the blizzard battering the windows. He laid her on his cot and covered her with blankets, her skin ice cold to the touch. He worked to bring warmth back into her, rubbing her hands, feeding her broth spoon by spoon. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips moving with words he couldn't understand. Sometimes she cried out in her sleep, small broken sounds that cut straight through his chest. When she flinched from his touch, even half-conscious, he realized her fear was not of the storm, it was of men, of being touched. So he sat by the fire through the night, keeping his distance, watching the slow return of color to her cheeks. For 2 days, the storm raged. He tended to her quietly, speaking only when necessary. On the morning of the 3rd day, the snow stopped. The world outside was white and blinding. She woke weak but alive. Caleb built a sleigh to take her back to town. When she thanked him, her voice shook. "You saved my life." He only nodded. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. As the sleigh glided through the snow, they didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of things neither dared say. When he dropped her at the edge of redemption, she looked back once. He watched her walk away until she disappeared into the store. That night, Caleb sat by his fire, the land silent around him. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. The days after the storm returned to their usual stillness, but something had shifted. Caleb tried to settle back into his quiet rhythm, repairing fence lines, feeding the stock, patching roofs, but the memory of the woman he'd saved kept rising like smoke he couldn't clear. Sometimes he caught himself looking toward the ridge where the stage trail curved, half expecting to see her silhouette against the winter sky. In the town of Redemption, AARA tried to do the same, fade back into her quiet life and forget the man who had carried her from death. But forgetting him was like trying to forget warmth after years of cold. The townsfolk, however, gave her no peace. The whispers grew sharper. "Mrs. Becca," Holt led the charge, her voice heavy with false virtue. "That one," she told the women at church, "spent 3 nights alone at a man's ranch. A decent woman wouldn't have." By week's end, the mercantile felt different. Mr. Henderson watched her with suspicion. Customers stopped talking when she entered. One morning, she came down the stairs to find her things piled neatly by the back door. Her sewing basket, her mending kit, her coat. The reason came soon enough. A silver locket belonging to Mrs. Holt had been found in her sewing bag. "I didn't take it," she said quietly. Her hands didn't shake. She was past that. Mr. Henderson's face stayed blank. "I can't have thieves working under my roof." No one defended her. She walked out into the cold street, her back straight, her heart hollow. For 2 days she stayed locked in her rented room, watching her last coins disappear. She had nowhere left to go, no one to trust. In the mirror, she saw a tired stranger staring back. Shame and fear pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. There was only one place left, one man she could turn to. She saddled a borrowed horse and rode through the cold gray morning toward the Blackwood Ranch. Mud clung to the animal's legs. The wind cut like glass. When the cabin came into view, Caleb was outside splitting wood. His axe rose and fell in steady rhythm until he saw her approach. He stopped mid-swing, resting the handle against his shoulder, eyes narrowing in surprise. A-R-A? She dismounted slowly, clutching her shawl tighter. "I'm sorry to come uninvited," she said. "I lost my position at the mercantile. I need work. Any kind. Cleaning, mending, cooking. I can do it." Caleb studied her for a long moment. Her eyes told the story. Her voice didn't. The humiliation, the fear, the last flicker of pride she refused to lose. He knew the gossip, knew what it meant if he took her in. The town would talk. But he also knew what it was to stand on the edge of nowhere. "I've got books that need sorting," he said finally, nodding toward the cabin. "And tack that needs mending. You can stay in the old homestead cabin near the trees. It's not much, but it'll keep you warm." Her breath caught, half relief, half disbelief. "You trust me?" He looked her straight in the eyes. "I don't listen to small-town tongues." That was all. No grand promises, no conditions. She whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Caleb," he said quietly. "If you're going to work here, call me Caleb." From that day, their lives began to intertwine. She rose early, lighting the stove before dawn. He brought in wood, nodding his thanks. Her mending needle flashed through leather straps and torn shirts. His steady hands carried hay and tools. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew softer, easier. Sometimes he found coffee brewing on the stove when he came in from the cold. Sometimes she returned to her cabin to find a stack of fresh firewood by the door. Neither mentioned these things, yet both noticed. Weeks passed. The snow melted. The land turned brown and wet under the Chinook winds. One night, the peace broke. Caleb woke to the sound of frantic bleating from the sheep pen near the creek. He grabbed his rifle and lantern and ran out into the night. The wind whipped at his coat as he saw shapes moving. Wolves, dark against the pale ground. He fired once into the air, shouting, "Get!" But hunger makes beasts bold. They scattered, then circled back. A light flared from across the yard. Era's lantern. "What is it?" she shouted. "Wolves! Keep back!" She didn't listen. She ran to grab another lantern, waving it to drive the flock toward the paddock. The two of them worked side by side in the freezing dark, shouts and gunfire echoing through the night. When a frightened ewe bolted, slamming into her, she stumbled, caught herself on the fence, and gasped. The wood had torn a deep gash along her arm. "I'm fine," she called, though her sleeve was dark with blood. By the time the last wolf fled, both were breathless. Caleb turned to her. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." "Let me see." He led her into the barn, where the light was warm and golden. She sat on a bale of hay, trembling slightly as he rolled up her sleeve. The gash was ugly red and raw, but beneath it, something else caught his eye. A scar, old, puckered, burned deep into the flesh of her upper arm. He froze. It was a brand. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He knew that Mark, two letters twisted together, an S and a C. He'd seen it before, carved into a ranch gate years ago, on a burned-out homestead where everyone was said to have died. Silas Kane. His hand went still, the lantern light flickering across his stunned face. A-R-A saw his expression change. Shame and terror washed over her. She pulled her arm back, whispering, "Please, not again." Her voice cracked on the words. "Don't look at me like that." He didn't move. He didn't speak. She tried to stand, but her knees gave way. Caleb caught her, not roughly, but with quiet certainty. He didn't say anything. He simply took the needle and thread she was reaching for, and began to stitch the wound himself, his rough hands moving with impossible gentleness. The air was thick with unspoken truths. She trembled, waiting for disgust, for rejection, but it never came. When he tied off the last stitch, he looked up, his voice low and steady. "Whoever did that to you," he said, nodding to the scar, "they don't own you anymore." Her tears came then, silent, shuddering, unstoppable. And, for the first time, Caleb didn't look away. The night of the wolf attack changed everything. After Caleb saw the brand on Ara's arm, the silence between them deepened, but not with fear. It carried something heavier, something sacred. He never asked what had happened. He didn't need to. He had seen enough of cruelty to know its signature. From that night forward, he guarded her, like a man protecting fire in a storm. He became quieter, but his presence was constant. Each morning, a rifle leaned by her door. Each evening, her cabin porch was stacked with new wood. The small kindnesses spoke for him. And slowly, Aara began to sleep again. The nightmares that had haunted her, fire, smoke, the sound of laughter turning to screams, faded into the background hum of the wind. But peace in the west never lasted long. One morning, she rode into Redemption for supplies. The town square buzzed with excitement. New wagons had arrived. Fine horses, polished wheels, men in suits too clean for this land. At their head was a tall man with silvering hair and eyes like polished steel. When he smiled, people smiled back, even if they didn't mean to. His name was Silas Kane. Aara froze where she stood. The world blurred. The sound of the street, the chatter, even the church bell, all vanished. That face. The same jawline, the same thin smile that had once hovered above her as her world burned. She couldn't move. Her breath came in shallow gasps. The spool of thread she held slipped from her hand, rolling across the dust. Then instinct took over. She turned and ran. By the time she reached the Blackwood Ranch, her horse was lathered with sweat. Caleb was mending a harness when she stumbled from the saddle. He barely had time to catch her before she fell to her knees, trembling. "He's here," she gasped. "Please, not again." Her voice broke on the words. "Silas Kane, he's in town." "You don't understand. He'll destroy everything. We have to go." Quote. Caleb's blood turned to ice. He had heard that name before, whispered in saloons, carved into fences of burned-out farms. He lifted her face, his hands steady despite the rage boiling inside him. "You're not running this time," he said firmly. "You hear me? You're safe here." Aara shook her head. "No one is safe from him." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Then we'll make sure he never hurts anyone again." That was the night Caleb Blackwood declared war. Silas Kane's first move came with politeness. A lawyer appeared at Caleb's door, claiming a boundary dispute, waving papers marked with Kane's seal. When that failed, men came, well-dressed surveyors driving stakes into Caleb's land. Then the accidents began. Cattle poisoned, fences cut. A ranch hand found beaten near the creek. Redemption turned against them. Mr. Henderson doubled prices. The blacksmith refused work, and Mrs. Holt whispered about that woman and her rancher, until even the pastor stopped nodding at them in church. But instead of breaking them, the isolation bound them tighter. They worked together in silence, their love growing in the shadow of danger. One cold evening, as twilight bled into blue, Caleb found Aara sitting by the creek, shoulders trembling with silent tears. He didn't ask why. He sat beside her, hands rough, voice gentle. "You don't have to face it alone anymore." She looked at him, the fire of her pain meeting the steady calm in his eyes. "He took everything from me once," she whispered. "Then we'll take it back," Caleb said. And in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken promise. When he leaned in, she didn't flinch. His lips found hers, soft, hesitant, then certain. The kiss was not born of passion, but of recognition, two broken souls finding the missing piece they hadn't known they were searching for. They began to plan. Caleb knew Kane's greed was bottomless, so he fed it. He rode to a distant town, sold a pouch of salted silver ore to a prospector, and made sure word spread. Soon, the rumor of a rich vein on the Blackwood Ranch reached Kane's ears. Within days, Kane arrived with 6 armed men, under cover of darkness, convinced he was taking not just land, but a fortune. What he didn't know was that Caleb and AARA were waiting. The place was called Devil's Jaw, a narrow canyon with walls that leaned close as if trying to crush the sky. Caleb had loosened rocks along the ridge, held in place by a single rope. AARA waited above with her rifle steady against the stone, her eyes fierce, breath calm. When Cain's men entered, Caleb cut the rope. The canyon thundered with falling rock, sealing their exit. Confusion exploded into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the walls. Shadows moved, and Caleb struck from them like a ghost. AARA fired once, twice. Each shot true, each echo bouncing a dozen times through the stone labyrinth. When the dust cleared, only two figures remained standing, Caleb and Silas Cain. Cain's fine coat was torn, his smile gone, his pistol raised. "You could have been rich, Blackwood," he spat. "Now you'll die like the rest of them." He fired. The bullet grazed Caleb's ribs, spinning him back. But before Cain could fire again, Ara's shot rang out from above, striking his shoulder. His gun fell to the dirt. Caleb lunged, tackling him into the gravel. They rolled, fists slamming, dust rising. Cain snarled like a trapped animal, but Caleb's fury was heavier. AARA scrambled down the slope, rifle in hand. She stopped beside them, her shadow falling across the man who had destroyed her life. Cain looked up at her, eyes wide, not with defiance, but fear. "You," he rasped. "I made you." Ara's voice was steady. "And now I'll unmake you." He reached for his fallen pistol, but fate chose quicker. The rock wall above them shifted with a deep groan. A boulder, loosened by the earlier slide, came crashing down. The sound was like thunder. When the dust cleared, Silas Cain was gone, buried beneath the land he had tried to steal. The canyon went still. AARA dropped to her knees beside Caleb, pressing her trembling hands against the wound in his side. "You're hurt." He grimaced but managed a faint smile. "Not bad enough to let you run off again." Quote, tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from fear. "It's over," she whispered. "He's gone." He reached up, his hand brushing her cheek. "It's over because of you." Days later, the truth spread through redemption. Cain's crimes surfaced, his papers exposed as lies. The town that had shunned Caleb and AARA now spoke their names with quiet respect, but neither cared for the talk. They stayed on the ranch. Life returned. Slowly, honestly. The grass grew green again, cattle grazed peacefully, and laughter began to echo through the cabin once more. One evening, as the sun sank over the valley, Caleb stood beside the 3 wooden crosses on the hill. AARA joined him, slipping her hand into his. Together they looked out at the horizon glowing gold. He turned to her, his voice soft. "The land took everything from me once, but it gave me you." AARA smiled through quiet tears, "And it gave me back myself." The wind whispered across the plains, gentle this time. The silence of the land was no longer lonely. It was home.